Public memory is proverbially short, and when we talk of Indian foreign policy in the post-Nehru years, we jump suddenly to Srimati Indira Gandhi and think that that is no interval, there is no interregnum, there is no interlude between Srimati Gandhi's succession to Prime Minister Nehru. But there was a very important interlude. There was a short span of time when Lal Bahadur Shastri was the Prime Minister of India. And not only he was the Prime Minister of India, there were two significant departures from Indian foreign policy in Nehru years in Shastriji's time. Nehru, when he died, had left the Indian foreign policy, many critics believe, in shambles. The relationship with China was in ruins. Pakistan was as distant a neighbor as ever could be. The smaller neighbors were not very happy in Nepal, Sri Lanka, or whatever. And the Russians or the Americans both looked at Nehru not with any particular degree of respect or credibility. India seemed to be all alone on the international arena. What Lal Bahadur Shastri did was to face the challenge thrown by Pakistan with great determination. He was a short-statured man. He had been a home minister. He was supposed to be a Gandhian. He was supposed to be a man committed to his principles. But nobody ever accused him of any special expertise in international affairs. And they thought that lacking the charisma of Nehru, lacking the stature of Nehru, lacking the experience in international diplomacy, he would be a miserable failure. But when the crisis came, he rose to the occasion. He gave army the free hand. He gave the nation the slogan Jai Jawan, Jai Kisan, establishing a link between the domestic policies, economic welfare of the people, farmers and the soldiers, where from the most of the soldiers came, not the officers but the rankers in the Indian army. And there was this nation building which took place almost effortlessly. But what was more remarkable was that the military was given orders not to hesitate and win as much ground as they could. Very soon, Indian army reached the threshold of Lahore city. The headworks of Ichogal Canal were under their control, and the Pakistanis did not know what hit them. The Indian Navy carried out daring operations in the vicinity of Karachi harbour. A very valiant captain died in the process, but the Indians downed the supposedly more sophisticated American planes and tanks. The Pakistani hopes that the Indian Muslims will rise in revolt were belied, and one of the martyrs of this conflict was Havaldar Abdul Hamid, who was given the Paramveer Chakra. And the point is that not only the Pakistanis failed in their intentions to divide the Indian society between Hindus and Muslims, they suffered a humiliating defeat. And what this meant was two things. It meant that the Americans' armament may have been more sophisticated, but the Pakistani army, lazy and parasitical by long years of army rule, was not in a position to use them properly. The second thing was that the Indian army, which had suffered a humiliating defeat in 1962, and India had lost a lot of its self-esteem, was no longer a pushover. It could take on Pakistan and it could defend its national interests. That was one part. The second equally important thing to consider about Lal Bahadur Shastri's prime ministerial reign is that, fine, he delivered a good victory to the nation. But victory on the battlefield is not enough. Ultimately, peace returns. Ultimately, there is a ceasefire. And ultimately, a good leader has to think about stable peace in years to come. And this is what Lal Bahadur Shastri undertook when he went to Tashkent to have talks with Field Marshal Ayub Khan. And therein is a very interesting story, anecdotal evidence, but documented very well, that everybody thought that Lal Bahadur Shastri would be no match to Field Marshal Ayub Khan, who had experience of international diplomacy, who had been an unchallenged dictator for almost a decade by then. And when they met, Field Marshal Ayub Khan jocularly asked Lal Bahadur Shastri, "Why do you expect me to make all the concessions? Why don't you yield a little?" And Lal Bahadur Shastri with a smile said that, "Look, you are a 6 feet few inches tall, a burly Pathan, an army general, field marshal. If I submit to you, I won't be able to go and face my people. They will say you were bullied by the leader. On the contrary, I'm a short-statured man, dhoti clad. Nobody accuses me of hectoring you, and you are a stronger man, and you perhaps can afford to make concessions." This massaged the ego of Field Marshal Ayub Khan reasonably, and Lal Bahadur Shastri did succeed in securing an agreement, Tashkent Agreement, which unfortunately we tend to forget because he died under tragic circumstances, some say under mysterious circumstances, plunging the nation into grief. But the Tashkent agreement did make two very important points: that Pakistan and India should resolve their outstanding differences through peaceful dialogue and bilaterally without an interference of a third party. So, this was a very significant diplomatic achievement. And I think it is worth mentioning that we also talk of administrative novelty which took place during Lal Bahadur Shastri's reign. The Prime Minister's Secretariat became the most important decision making department in the government of India. It was a kind of a super secretariat conducting oversight over External Affairs Ministry, Defense Ministry, and Home Ministry, and a trustworthy secretary to the Prime Minister came to occupy this position. A senior civil servant who had a good equation with the Prime Minister. And this office became even more important when Mrs. Gandhi succeeded Lal Bahadur Shastri. But what we should remember is that this Prime Ministerial Secretariat, Tashkent Agreement, and the decisive victory in battlefield, all three belong to Lal Bahadur Shastri's short tenure. Now it is time to once again ask the same question. What was India like when Mrs. Gandhi inherited the crown of thorns, the Prime Ministership of India? What was the world like in 1966 when she came? Three things quickly need to be reminded. Srimati Gandhi was resisted by the old guard, the senior leaders of the Congress party, who had somehow conceded that Lal Bahadur Shastri, a person who had worked with Govind Ballabh Pant, a person who had played a subordinate role, who had been a home minister, who had been a railway minister, a trusted person in Mr. Nehru's cabinet, was the Prime Minister. But they were absolutely reluctant to accept a daughter of the great man who in their mind had no qualifications. She was not even a graduate. She had held ministerial office as IMB minister for a short while. She had been the Congress president, but everybody thought that she had been given that as nepotistic appointments by a doting father. So nobody thought that she was accused of being a dumb doll. She was accused of being nothing else but a good hostess. But people forget that the father had prepared the daughter rather well to conduct international relations and project a good image. She had been educated in Shantiniketan. She had spent time in Cambridge University. She spoke French like a native. She never needed an interpreter. She had traveled abroad reasonably, and she was not a novice to entertaining and meeting high-ranking dignitaries as a hostess in her father's home. So all these were qualifications. There were some disqualifications, but the greatest disqualification was that she had inherited the party which revolted against her. Her first priority was to establish that she was the undisputed leader of the Congress party, so she could claim the prime ministership in her own right. To do this, she had to split the Congress party, give a few novel populist slogans. She had to undertake policies which would let people know that she was the decisive leader. She abolished the princely estates and the privy purses. She nationalized the banks. She projected herself as the savior of the poor, particularly of the women and children, scheduled caste and scheduled tribes. And she would always fall back on the legacy of Nehru and her days as a child freedom fighter, leader of Vanar Sena, a favorite child of Mahatma Gandhi, and so on and so forth. Her secular image was untarnished. She had been married to a Parsi, and she had been raised in a household which was open to all kinds of ideas. Now, Srimati Gandhi succeeded in doing this, but this took all the energies between 1966 to 67-68. There was another interesting situation in India. In 67-68, in the Legislative Assembly elections, a lot of states had been lost to the Congress. The Congress party had lost them to dissidents from old Congress, people who had formed their own parties, regional parties, and this rise of anti-Congressism had made the central government a little less dynamic in the context of pursuit of diplomacy and foreign policy. That was one part. The second part was even more disastrous. It was that India had just come out of the throes of a major famine in Bihar, in the district of Palamu, that was part of Bihar, now Jharkhand, and Mrs. Gandhi was dependent on food grains feeding her people, on import of food grains from America. There was a great scheme called PL 480, but this PL 480 scheme was made India dependent on American food grains, and the Americans left no opportunity to humiliate India about its non-alignment, about its independence by saying that, look, you can't feed your people. You go around with a begging bowl. You are dependent from ship to mouth morsels of food which we make available to you. What is the point of trying to strut the stage as a major power, as a rising power on international arena? First, Johnson did it. Subsequently, Nixon and Kissinger outdid him. So Mrs. Gandhi gave a priority to making India self-sufficient in the production of food grains. So the ambitious program of Green Revolution was launched, which succeeded ultimately, which had problems of its own. But Mrs. Gandhi did succeed in restoring the self-respect of the Indian people in terms of food grains. Mrs. Gandhi was also busy trying to get her act together. She realized that there was not only dissidence in the Congress party, there was not only resistance to her policies by the rightists, she also knew that her tilting towards Soviet Union was not liked by the Americans. Now, tilting is an ugly word, but let us not forget that Mrs. Gandhi was a minority government and she was in power supported by the Communist Party of India. Some of her closest advisors like Mohan Kumar Mangalam were members of the CPI. Also, her principal secretary, Mr. P.N. Huxer, had been at one time a member of the British Communist Party. They were sympathetic to the socialistic mode of production and also centralized planning, and democratic centralism again is an ugly word in the context of communist states, but some of it was finding resonance in India then. So nationalizations, mixed economy, state controlling strictly economic enterprise was all there. Those were the days when Mrs. Gandhi found it convenient to target America and say that whoever is against me is a foreign hand, CIA is working against me, they don't like my proximity to Soviet Union. But Mrs. Gandhi's proximity to Soviet Union was nothing new. As we have seen in an earlier lecture, it's worth reminding people that Mrs. Gandhi was close to Soviet Union because Soviet Union in the days of Mr. Nehru had been generous with its assistance in building up steel plants, chemical fertilizers, antibiotics and vaccines, and had given Indians armaments, aircraft, tanks, submarines, aircraft carriers and so on, help India with exploration of space, help India with exploration of oil. So Mrs. Gandhi was not only being grateful, only because she was being supported by CPI, she also had the memories of Soviet Union using its veto to save India from the machinations of Americans and the Pakistanis, at times the Chinese. That's one part. But this led to one other crisis. There was another challenge which Mrs. Gandhi was facing at this moment, not at the national level, but very much so in West Bengal. This was the time when they say the era of Spring Thunder, the Naxalite insurgency broke out, and the Naxalite idealistic youth gave up their studies, engineering colleges and universities, took to jungles, fought there, some died very wretched deaths. But the problem was that there was an extraterritorial loyalty which was mouthed by these people. The slogans raised were Ho Ho, Ho Chi Minh, our chairman Mao Zedong, Lal Salam, etc. And there was a period of anarchy when policemen guarded traffic policemen in the city like Calcutta. Calcutta was beset by hartals, gheraos and everything, and it appeared that this violent insurgency would spread. This was also the time when Chinese were obviously shamelessly helping the Maoist faction. CPI-M had split into a Maoist faction, Marxist-Leninist faction. There were several more splinters later which do not detain us here. But there were armed insurgencies in Northeast, in Nagaland, in Manipur, in Mizoram, and these insurgents at the drop of a hat crossed over to Myanmar, and where they had to be given hot pursuit. But it became transparent that the Chinese were helping some of these dissident insurgents to put pressure on India. So Mrs. Gandhi would have liked to review the relationship with China, but as long as the Chinese were helping armed insurgencies in Northeast, she couldn't afford to do so. As long as the Naxalite violence was being fomented with encouragement, inspiration from China, this could not be done. So Mrs. Gandhi was beset in the first 3-4 years of her first term in office with economic difficulties, with anti-congressism, violent, revolutionary, extreme left insurgencies, insurgencies of tribal insurgents in the Northeast, and also there were signs of states getting out of Congress control, like West Bengal into CPI-M, Tamil Nadu to one tribal party or the other, where they have reigned uninterrupted since that time. So Mrs. Gandhi had these problems, and she still did the best she could around this time. By the time we reached 69-70, an unforeseen, unprecedented opportunity unexpectedly opened up before Mrs. Gandhi. This was the Pakistanis first had to cope with the agitation of the Bengalis, East Pakistan, in favor of democratic elections. When the elections took place, the Awami League of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman won a resounding victory, and by any logic of a democracy, Sheikh Mujib should have been the Prime Minister of Pakistan. But the Pakistani armed forces, ensconced in power for years, totally corrupt, totally feudal, were in no mood to share power with the weak, rice-eating, fish-eating Bengalis whom they looked down upon. Bengalis might have been more numerous, but they thought that the Pathans and the Punjabis were more fit to rule. Now, unfortunately, Yahya Khan and Tikka Khan, the military martial law administrator in Pakistan and the person given in charge of East Pakistan, both behaved in a brutal, inhuman manner, and the suppression of the democratic aspirations of Bengalis in East Pakistan resulted in a flood of refugees into India, which was almost touched the figure of 2 million at one stage. This put an unbearable burden on India's social fabric, India's economic well-being, and also raised up the communal tensions. Now, Mrs. Gandhi tried her best through diplomatic missions sent abroad in the whole year of 69-70 to let the world know what was happening and put pressure on Pakistan to curb this genocide. Americans were reluctant to do so. Books like Blood Telegram make it abundantly clear. They turned a blind eye. They wanted to use Pakistan to open a door for their normalization of relationship with China, and they were prepared to pay the price of the massacre of Bengalis for this reason. Mrs. Gandhi ultimately had to realize that she could not be a silent spectator. So she decided to intervene on humanitarian grounds and help the liberation fighters of Mukti Bahini in Bangladesh. Some people say Mukti Bahini was BSF dressed up in lungis. Others say that they were genuine militants who had taken shelter in India, went back to fight the war against the Pakistanis. The wounds have not healed as yet. There has been no reconciliation or closure in Bangladesh till this date. Sheikh Hasina is still trying to bring to book the people who had betrayed the nation then, murdered the father of the nation, and sided and had collaborated with the Pakistani army during those dark days. But that's a different tale altogether. Mrs. Gandhi had another great achievement during this period in her foreign policy and diplomacy context, which is worth remarking in Indian foreign policy's history. She forged a treaty of peace and friendship with Soviet Union, which made Soviet Union undertake that any attack on India would be treated as an attack on Soviet Union, and Soviet Union would not watch silently. Now, without this guarantee, India would not have been in a position to confidently intervene in Bangladesh. Americans tried to blackmail Indians. They ordered steamship Enterprise up the Bay of Bengal, which was a nuclearly armed aircraft carrier. But Mrs. Gandhi did not flinch. The Chinese also threatened to intervene, but they could not, because ever since 1969 and the bloody clashes they had at the Usuri River with the Soviets, there had been a great difference between the Chinese and the Soviets. They were ever since the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Chinese had distrusted the Soviets, but then they thought that the Soviets had sided with the Indian friends rather than the Chinese brothers in 62. In 69, after the clash, the cleavage between the two was almost complete, but in 71, the Chinese did not have the guts to take on Soviets and Indians together in favor of saving Pakistan. So this bluff and bluster of Americans did not succeed, the Chinese did not succeed. Mrs. Gandhi was praised in the parliament in ecstatic terms by nobody else but her greatest critic, Nehru's greatest critic, Congress Party's greatest critic, Atal Bihari Vajpayee of the ultra-nationalist party, Bharatiya Janata Sangh, who said that Srimati Gandhi has proved herself to be a lion-mounted goddess Durga who annihilates all the enemies of the nation. Now, this was the kind of a victory which nullified partition, which broke Pakistan into two, which disgraced Pakistani army to the utter depths of humiliation, and Srimati Gandhi overnight became a charismatic heroine, worthy of the claims which her admirers used to make, that she was like Joan of Arc, she was like Rani Jhansi. But when you deify a leader like this, there are hazards. Mrs. Gandhi basks in the glory for a short while, but let's not get into what happened subsequently. Let's not fast forward the history. Military war and the victory in military war was much more decisive than it was even in 1965. 1965, Pakistan could claim it was maybe a stalemate. Nobody would believe that. But Pakistan was broken into two, and it was an abject surrender signed in Dhaka in the presence of the whole world watching, and India had captured almost close to 100,000, 93,000 plus Pakistani prisoners of war and occupied a lot of Pakistani land. So Mrs. Gandhi not only achieved a decisive military victory on battleground, she also had the foresight to see that if we are to have peaceful relationship with Pakistan, if we want stable peace on the subcontinent, we have to have a treaty, an arrangement, a ceasefire, a closer to this. Mrs. Gandhi had Simla Summit, where she talked with a person closer to her in age and background, Cambridge-educated Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, who brought his daughter Fatima Bhutto. There was a lot of bonhomie, and some people say that Mrs. Gandhi was hoodwinked by Bhutto, charmed by Bhutto into surrendering lots of the gains of the battleground. We don't think so. The criticism is fair because Mrs. Gandhi could not have kept almost 100,000 Pakistani prisoners fed and looked after their health and well-being for an unlimited number of years. Similarly, the bone of contention of the land occupied after a war would have added to one more irritant in Indo-Pakistan relationship. So I think the settlement arrived at Shimla, which seemed to reinforce the argument of Tashkent that India and Pakistan should settle all their dispute bilaterally, should settle their peaceful dialogue, was something which Mrs. Gandhi could not anticipate would be betrayed so soon by Zulfikar Ali. Now, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto might have been a wily fox, might have taken Mrs. Gandhi for a ride, but he took advantage of the certain situation where Mrs. Gandhi was prepared to regain her place in the international community by saying that she was magnanimous in victory and she wanted lasting peace on the subcontinent. And this was done. But then 71 and 72 were the last year when Mrs. Gandhi enjoyed unmitigated, unalloyed popularity. After 72, internal things started bothering Mrs. Gandhi. There were accusations on her son of corruption. There were aspersions cast against her that she was so smitten by the love for his good-for-nothing young son that she would let him write roughshod over ministers and decisions of honest government officers. Slowly, her trusted advisors were keeping a distance from at least from her son. She didn't like it, but Mrs. Gandhi was so busy maintaining peace and order in certain parts of the country where people had virtually risen in revolt against her government. This started with Loknayak Jayaprakash Narayan having Nav Nirman movement. First, it started as the housewives movement in Gujarat, who came out on the streets with rolling pins and thalis and creating a din. It spread to students in Bihar, to UP, and it was a price rise movement. It was a movement against the promises not being delivered. It was against dynastic succession. It was about corruption. And unfortunately, the climax was soon created then when an election petition filed against Mrs. Gandhi's election by Rajanaran, the socialist leader, was decided in his favor by the High Court. People expected Mrs. Gandhi to resign, which she did not. She was ill-advised to continue. Naini Palkiwala, her trusted advisor, a prestigious lawyer, returned the brief. But she decided instead to appeal and remain in office. And in the process, she was again advised even worse to impose emergency, which was done without consulting anybody in the parliament. In a great haste, the president was made to sign as a rubber stamp, and all the major leaders of the opposition were arrested and thrown in jail. Now, this was the darkest period in Indian democracy and also for Indian foreign policy, because India in one stroke probably lost all it had gained over the years as a constitutional democratic republic, secular in intent and spirit, and also where fundamental rights of people were respected. Now, Mrs. Gandhi, trying to stifle criticism of her son, her own election, her election petition, opted for a method which ruined India's image in international community. Lots of people took refuge in foreign countries. Subramaniam Swamy, Ram Jethmalani, some other intellectuals, Madhavrao Scindia, who was then an independent member of parliament, not yet a member of the Congress party. Now, all this created a very adverse public opinion against India in international arena. People thought that India would never come out of these dark ages. But for some reason, Mrs. Gandhi decided in 1977 to declare elections. And the elections were declared and Mrs. Gandhi was turned out of office. And Mrs. Gandhi was jailed for a short while. Mrs. Gandhi had to come out on the streets fighting for her rights to save herself. She talked of the conspiracies against her at all. But then came a period of another year and a half and 2 year interlude when Mrs. Gandhi was not the prime minister. There were prime ministers who had always hated her. People like Morarji Desai and co, Chaudhry Charan Singh. And this period was when prime ministers ceased to take interest in Indian foreign policy. Morarji Desai was only interested in his Gandhian dogmatism, and Gandhi never was as dogmatic as his follower Morarji Desai. Gandhi had an open mind. Gandhi was open to debate and discussion. Morarji was not. He had earlier been a PCS officer. As a chief minister, he had brought about prohibition, which spawned organized crime in Maharashtra. But as a prime minister, he thought he knew all and he had needed no advice. Unfortunately, his lieutenants were no other like the Chaudhry Charan Singh, whose interests, some say, never extended beyond India, and the harshest critics say that he never thought beyond UP. But they were senior Congress leaders, octogenarians, nonagenarians, but no energy left in them, and they were not interested in anything else but running the government as soon as they could. And the joke was that there were three widows fighting all the time amongst themselves, and unfortunately, the government fell very soon. Elections had to be declared again, and Mrs. Gandhi came to power again. But one brief remark before we come to Mrs. Gandhi's second term in office. Morarji Desai was the Prime Minister of India when Bhutto was judicially executed in Pakistan, and the power was usurped by one of his one-time proteges, General Zia. General Zia started the Islamization of Pakistan in a manner which was unimaginable. The dogmatic, aggressive interpretation of Islam, the Wahhabi Islam exported from Saudi Arabia with petrodollars, started in this time. This is the time when the shared heritage between India and Pakistan was carefully, systematically eroded in history textbooks, and of course poison against India was sown. Once when Mrs. Morarji Desai was asked, how do you react to Bhutto's assassination? So he nonchalantly answered, this is the Pakistan's internal matter. How does it concern us? This sort of lack of interest in happenings next door, which had directly impinged on security and integrity of India, I think was short-sighted to say the extreme. This was something which is incomprehensible even with the advantage of hindsight. Mrs. Gandhi assumed her office, and lots of people felt that in the second term of office, she would have learned her lessons. She would behave differently. She would make several course corrections. This was not to be, because what had happened was that Mrs. Gandhi, before she could stabilize in office, lost her young son in a tragic air accident. This removed Sanjay Gandhi from the scene of action, an extra constitutional center of power, a villain of the emergency. But at the same time, Mrs. Gandhi was a broken person after that. She had to rely on another trusted member of the family, her reluctant son to join politics, Rajiv Gandhi, who was a pilot and who reluctantly joined, and Mrs. Gandhi tried to rely more and more on her advice. But this was the time when Mrs. Gandhi was having domestic trouble at home between the two daughters-in-laws, Sanjay's widow and Rajiv's wife. She was having a problem of, she was aging and she was no longer in control. Whatever she had planned for her younger son was not fructifying. There were rumors about her advisors like Devendra Brahmachari, who was supposed to be the Rasputin-like character advising her, and she, the yoga teacher for her. So all kind of a murky tales. But Mrs. Gandhi also was beset with major problems in domestic politics. But before we come to the second phase, there are two things from the first term of office which remained as a credit-worthy inheritance for Mrs. Gandhi in the second term. She had experimented with the peaceful explosion of a nuclear device in Pokhran 1, displaying to the world that India was capable of making a nuclear weapon if she wanted. She had sent Indians with Soviet assistance to explore space. So India was in the Space League, and India may not have landed a man on the moon, but India had a number of communication satellites which made India pan-Indian footprint of a television communication possible. So these two things, the Pokhran 1 and the space exploration, were also the goodwills which Mrs. Gandhi carried with her with the residual memories of 1971 in the second term of office. So emergency was, again she became a victim, she had lost her son and people sympathized with her. And the way she had resisted the Janta government's persecution also made her a heroine in the minds of certain people. So petty bickerings, feuds of the Janta party, she was above them. She said that I'm above this petty conflict. But Mrs. Gandhi, the moment she assumed office, had also to face with the mounting Khalistani. Now, this is interesting because the story of Khalistani threat deserves to be told somewhere else in greater detail. But the Punjab politics, this ever since partition, has been the demand of a Punjabi Suba, a Punjabi-speaking state, where Sikhs had a primacy. This was granted to it when Haryana was carved out of Punjab, when Himachal Pradesh was carved out of Punjab. So the Dogri and Himachali and Hamirpuri speaking areas went to Himachal and Haryana took the burden of the Hindi speaking people. But this did not satisfy the Punjabis because the pole of contention at one time was the capital of Chandigarh, which became a union territory, and the Punjabis felt, especially the Jat Sikhs, especially after the Green Revolution, that they had the money, they were powerful and rich and recognized elsewhere in the diaspora, but in Indian politics, they were not given their due. Part of the reason the Khalistani threat became a challenge for Indian foreign policy is that some of the extreme elements in Khalistani movement propagating violence took shelter as refugees in Canada and in England, collected money for the Khalistani activities, and with the help of Pakistan, through Pakistan, infiltrated in Punjab and unleashed a reign of terror where Hindus were murdered, where non-Sikhs were murdered, Sikhs who did not conform to their ideology were murdered, and a series of dogmatic fundamentalist excesses were committed. At this stage, because of reasons of domestic politics, Mrs. Gandhi made a series of mistakes. She first of all trusted on Pakistani leaders like Zain Singh, Darbara Singh, who had an agenda of their own. Then she put up Bhindranwala to counter the dogmatic fundamentalist ideology of the Khalistanis. At times she switched her loyalties to Shiromani Akali Dal, but Shiromani Akali Dal had been against her during the Janta government regime ever since post-emergency, so the Badals were against there. So the whole problem is that the politics of Punjab became a politics of personal vendetta and retribution, and reconciliation was not there. Khalistanis did not make things easy. Khalistanis taking shelter in Canada blew up airliner Kanishka. They continued to work against Indian interests in UK, and also one small Central American country recognized the provisional government of Khalistan. So Khalistan was a threat not only because of what was happening in Punjab, but it was also a threat because what it could potentially do to Indian damage because of Pakistani machinations. Now, till this date, we haven't been able to get over that. And unfortunately, the wounds created after Mrs. Gandhi's death and anti-Sikh riots, which we shall talk about it subsequently, created a problem where the Sikh-Hindu divide has never actually really healed. This was also the time when Pakistan, taking a leak out of India's humanitarian intervention in Bangladesh, was asserting, supporting the right of self-determination of Kashmiris, and slowly alienation and disaffection and separatism were being spread through Pakistani money, through drugs, and Pakistani separatist tanzeems were taking shape with Pakistani assistance. There were aerial hijackings, Pakistanis were funding the Kashmiri dissidents, and there were Pakistani flags flying, there was jubilant celebration at Pakistani's victories in cricket matches and so on. So Mrs. Gandhi couldn't remain indifferent to that either. Mrs. Gandhi also was not totally unaware of whatever was happening in Sri Lanka, because by the time the Dravid parties in Tamil Nadu were supporting the Litte terrorists and Litte dissidents, Srimati Gandhi knew that she had to tread a careful path. But Mrs. Gandhi was fighting on three fronts separately. She was fighting the Khalistani threat and the Khalistani support in Canada, UK, in Central America. She was fighting the threat of the Maoist internal insurgency supported by the Chinese. She was also fighting against the instability caused by the Chinese activity and activism in Nepal. She was not unaware of what was happening in Sri Lanka, but at the same time, The time was short and she knew she had to deliver on lots of things on economic front. The expectations she had aroused, not all of them could be fulfilled, and she was slowly losing her trusted supporters and advisors one by one. Mrs. Gandhi was murdered under tragic circumstances by her own Khalistan supporter bodyguards, and this unleashed countrywide almost genocidal riots against the Sikhs, against the innocent Sikhs who had nothing to do with Mrs. Gandhi's assassination. But part of it was the pent up anger and helpless, impotent rage against the doings of Khalistanis for a whole decade. And so, where helpless Hindus, policemen in uniform, a DIG Atwal at the doorstep of Harmandir Sahib was killed brutally and no punishment had been meted out. So Mrs. Gandhi ordering Operation Blue Thunder, which led to charges of sacrilege of the Sikh shrine, quite correctly. But did Mrs. Gandhi had a choice? Mrs. Gandhi, had she got a choice, she probably wouldn't have taken this decision, which was a life-threatening risk for her own self. She paid with her life, but that is the story which ends with Mrs. Gandhi. And this is the closure of another chapter, although the person who succeeded Mrs. Gandhi under tragic circumstances was her own son Rajiv. Rajiv was in his personality and temperament and training a person totally different from his younger brother, who was maligned with good reason as an extra constitutional center of power. Rajiv was a professional pilot. He had mild manners. He had a pleasing personality, and he surrounded himself by advisors who were professional managers from industry, from companies, or from entrepreneur families. People like Arun Nehru, people like Arun Singh, people like Kamal Nath, people like his flying mate Satish Sharma, his childhood friend Amitabh Bachchan. Some of them created problems for him subsequently. But here was a man who was talking openly of the corruption in his own party. When he was general secretary, he said that of a rupee earmarked as aid for the poorest of the poor, only maybe 2 annas or an anna reaches the poor man. Rest, like a slab of ice, melts in the hands when it passes from hand to hand. So people had high hopes from him. He was the first man who talked in terms of preparing India for the 21st century. And mind you, this was a full 16, 17 years before the next century was turning. He was talking of a computer IT revolution. He was talking of a telecom revolution, and he was trying to achieve everything in the mission mode. Drinking water mission mode, telecom mission mode, everything was a mission mode. So people thought that he would deliver fast, and he also tried to decentralize political power by introducing Panchayati Raj, and he took interesting initiatives in the foreign policy realm. He had an Africa fund established. His advisor was Manishankar Iyer, his senior in Cambridge, one-time foreign service officer. He also was trying to do something about disarmament by having a 6-nation disarmament dialogue or a bridge somewhere. But before all these things could fructify, before he had reached the middle of his term, he was beset and besieged by charges of corruption, which were very grave. This was related to the purchase of Bofors guns. The sum was very small compared to the scandals and scams which have since taken place, 64 crore rupees. And the guns subsequently were proved to be very good during the Kargil conflict, but that's a digression. Rajiv Gandhi's friends, trusted friends, let him down very badly. Whether it was Satish Sharma, whether it was Amitabh Bachchan, who tried to make most of their proximity to Rajiv Gandhi, and Rajiv Gandhi could not betray their friends. So those who could not live with this kind of a tolerance of corruption under the nose left. They left like Arun Singh. Honest ministers like Vishwanath Pratap Singh found it impossible to work in a coterie culture of this kind. But the point is that these people stayed back, and you had trusted socialist leaning members like Himmati Nandan Bahuguna being humiliated by sycophants like Bhutta Singh and people like Zail Singh. And so the problem is that Rajiv Gandhi had an uneasy relationship with Zail Singh as a president. He could tolerate rank, incompetent, corrupt people in the ministry. He could not get rid of corrupt friends, and he could not ever absolve himself from posthumously, he was absolved, but he could not live down the ignominy of somebody like a middleman like Quattrochi, moving in and out freely of the Prime Minister's office just because he spoke Italian and he was close to Sonia. So the unfortunate part is that Rajiv Gandhi, who came with the image of Mr. Clean, ultimately had his hands soiled, had his face reasonably blackened, and he had to demit office under rather inglorious circumstances. So the promise of nuclear disarmament, promise of Africa Fund, promise of India resuming its leadership of African world were belied. The sad part is that Rajiv Gandhi is the one who talked about India Incorporated, who talked about the possibility of unleashing India's productive power by having economic reforms. But he did not get the time in his lifetime to do this. His other major mistake in foreign policy terms was getting involved with the Sinhala civil war situation. The Tamil governments wanted to support and put pressure on the center to support the Litte. And there was a stage when Litte, some members of Litte were trained in Indian military establishment in guerrilla warfare, jungle warfare in India. But when they went back, they refused to be persuaded and follow India's advice and became a really like a Bhasmasur situation or Frankenstein's monster, if you like. Sri Lankan government, which had asked India to dispatch an Indian peacekeeping mission force in Sri Lanka, were forced to say after some time that please take back your force. Now, unfortunately, in the meantime, the Sri Lankan army withdrew itself from the battlefront. Indian soldiers were thrust to do or die in this battle with the Litte. And the Litte, one of the most fierce terrorist organizations in the world, bloodthirsty, managed to kill their one-time advisors and supporters because they had been trained by them in the jungle warfare and counterinsurgency. Rajiv Gandhi ultimately there were two attacks on him. When he was attending a guard of honor in Sri Lanka, a blow was given on his head by a person in the parade ground. The second time was that when he visited during his election campaign, trying to regain power, Perambadur, he was blown to bits by a bomb, by a suicide bomber, and some people who survived. So he paid the price for his blunder in Sri Lankan policy by Litte, and it's difficult to imagine why he did that, because he had such a majority in the parliament that he did not have to make concessions to the Dravid parties in Tamil Nadu or to get involved in Sri Lanka in any case. The other thing where the neighbors were unhappy with Rajiv Gandhi was when he imposed a short-term blockade on Nepal, when he thought that the Nepalese were not being reasonably sensitive to India's security concerns. Indian planes had been hijacked from Kathmandu to Kabul via Nepal, and the Nepalese were still given their two outlets to a landlocked country in international law, but the Nepalese started nursing a grievance against Rajiv Gandhi. Now, the problem is the neighborhood policy of Rajiv Gandhi probably was rectified by somebody to the other extreme when Mr. Gujral became a Prime Minister, but we shall talk about that a little later. Before we conclude the contributions, the successes and failures of Rajiv Gandhi in the realm of foreign policy, we have to take note of two or three small things. A, Rajiv Gandhi was a very trusting man. He delegated power. He did not have a exclusive concern to keep the foreign policy to himself. He would let Manishankar Iyer do what he wanted to do in Africa. He would let him be advised about the nuclear non-proliferation. So these were the, so to speak, relics of the days of Nehruvian foreign policy, which were obsolete by the time the Pokhran 1 had already exploded. The other thing is that after he was voted out of power, and he devoted all his energies to coming back to power, his focus was so much on coming back to power that he did not realize that his successors were ruining the very basis of Indian foreign policy. People like Chandrasekhar, people like Vishwanath Pratap Singh were just not interested in foreign policy. The only thing Chandrasekhar ji would be remembered would be of mortgaging India's gold from Reserve Bank to tide over a foreign exchange crisis, which was a very bad thing to project abroad about India's credibility, about India's sovereign guarantees, and so on and so forth. Vishwanath Pratap Singh was only concerned about proving that he was the most honest person and he had not only an image, but he was a most principled person, and he was fond of painting, he was fond of Hindi poetry, he was fond of rhetoric, but I think the delivery, he was very much short. He would symbolically ride motorcycles with a turban round his head, but I think he did not have the touch to mingle with the peoples. People remembered his failure when he was chief minister of UP, when his own brother, who was a high court judge, was murdered and he could do nothing. And he had this problem that Raja Sahab Manda was big landlord, but not quite a priestly family. He belonged to the upper Thakur caste. So he had the arrogance of that at times, but he also wanted to project his image as the man of the people. But some people with long memories never forgot that he had been brought into the politics by Sanjay Gandhi and introduced into the central cabinet as a deputy minister by Sanjay Gandhi, by his bidding. So he had changed colors like a chameleon. Also, some people would say there were charges against him. Some say trumped up totally. Some say there is no fire, smoke without a fire, about the same tickets. But that is a different story. I think neither Vishwanath Pratap Singh nor Chandrasekhar had any inclination towards foreign policy. Chandrasekhar perhaps was only interested in happenings in Nepal, where he had close relationships with the Koirala family, with Sheljaji, with other people who had been fighting with socialists, and he would do that. Then we come to the period of Narsingh Rao. But Narsingh Rao is interesting because Narsingh Rao emerged from the wings, so to speak, after everybody had written him off. He had packed his bags, gone back home, did not want to contest elections, but Rajiv Gandhi died, and there was so much confusion that he would inherit. Narendra Tiwari was elsewhere, and Narsingh Rao was the man of the moment. And Narsingh Rao had been a trustworthy, loyal, silent, he chose to call himself an outsider, but he was an archetypal insider. So he had worked as a foreign minister, a finance minister, minister in different capacities, HRD minister. He was a multilingual person. He could speak Hindi, though he belonged to the Andhra Pradesh. So he had multiple identities where he could sell himself. But the problem was that what he realized is to realize the dream first articulated by Rajiv Gandhi, who wanted to liberalize economically, who wanted to make India a tech-savvy nation for 21st century, and time was not ripe. By the time Rajiv Gandhi died and he was beset by his problems of coming back to power, he did not have time to see how the world was changing. He could not take stock that Soviet Union had ceased to exist, the new Russia had emerged, and Russia was on the verge of anarchy and bankruptcy and needed India more than India needed Russia ever in the past. But that is a different story which unfolded after Rajiv Gandhi's assassination. It was left to Narsingh Rao to claim the credit for liberalizing India, putting the finances under the charge of Manmohan Singh, who subsequently became a foreign minister, and he himself let other people in his government conduct foreign policy, and he would be happy taking credit for whatever was happening successfully. In course of time, Narsingh Rao himself was caught in a web of corruption charges, but that's different. And foreign policy under Narsingh Rao and under Manmohan Singh, and a short interregnum in between before Manmohan Singh came. No, it's not really a short interregnum. It is an interregnum, short interregnum, and a long interregnum of BJP regime. So we are talking of almost 4-5 year segments where governments changed, parties changed, but the continuity in Indian foreign policy was maintained, and the crossing of Rubicon, to borrow Rajmohan's phrase, was done, and India, from a tilt towards Soviet Union, went towards the American side.